Question 1. The review process indicates that the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, has issued a permit denial to a manufacturing company, citing concerns about potential water pollution. The company, believing ADEM misinterpreted the relevant state environmental regulations and acted arbitrarily, seeks judicial review in an Alabama circuit court. What is the most appropriate standard and scope of review for the circuit court to apply when examining ADEM decision? Option A. The court should review the administrative record to determine if ADEM decision was supported by substantial evidence, if ADEM acted within its statutory authority, and if its actions were arbitrary, capricious, or otherwise an unlawful exercise of its authority, as provided by Alabama law. Option B. The court should focus primarily on whether the permit denial resulted in a financially unfavorable outcome for the company, regardless of whether ADEM followed proper procedures or interpreted the regulations correctly. Option C. The court should defer entirely to ADEM interpretation of the environmental regulations and its factual findings, even if there is clear evidence that ADEM misapplied the law or acted outside its delegated powers. Option D. The court should conduct a completely new hearing, re-evaluating all evidence presented to ADEM and making an independent determination of whether the permit should have been granted, as if the agency's decision had never occurred. The correct answer is A. The court should review the administrative record to determine if ADEM decision was supported by substantial evidence, if ADEM acted within its statutory authority, and if its actions were arbitrary, capricious, or otherwise an unlawful exercise of its authority, as provided by Alabama law. Explanation. The review process indicates a situation where an administrative agency's decision in Alabama is being challenged, raising questions about the scope and limits of judicial review. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the agency's delegated authority to implement and enforce laws with the fundamental right of individuals or entities to seek redress from potentially arbitrary or unlawful agency actions. The challenge lies in discerning when a court should defer to agency expertise and when it should intervene to correct errors of law or procedure, all within the specific framework of Alabama administrative law. Careful judgment is required to avoid overstepping judicial bounds or failing to provide necessary oversight. The correct approach involves a thorough examination of the agency's action against the relevant Alabama statutes and administrative rules governing the agency's authority and the specific subject matter of the dispute. This includes assessing whether the agency exceeded its statutory authority, misinterpreted the law, or failed to follow its own procedural rules. The legal basis for this approach is found in Alabama Code Title 41, Chapter 22, Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, which outlines the grounds for judicial review of agency actions. Specifically, Section 41-22-20 provides for judicial review and enumerates grounds such as unlawful, arbitrary, capricious, or unreasonable exercise of authority, or action not supported by substantial evidence. This approach prioritizes adherence to established legal standards and ensures that judicial review is grounded in the specific legal framework governing the agency. An incorrect approach would be to substitute the court's own judgment for that of the agency on matters within the agency's expertise, absent a clear legal error. This would violate the principle of deference to agency expertise, which is a cornerstone of administrative law. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the perceived fairness of the outcome, without regard to whether the agency acted within its legal authority or followed proper procedures. This overlooks the procedural and substantive legal requirements that govern agency actions and judicial review under Alabama law. Finally, an approach that ignores the substantial evidence standard for reviewing factual findings and instead demands a de novo reevaluation of all evidence would also be incorrect, as Alabama courts are generally required to uphold agency factual findings if supported by substantial evidence. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a precise identification of the agency action being challenged and the specific legal provisions under which it was taken. This is followed by a careful review of the administrative record to determine if the agency's decision was based on substantial evidence and if the agency acted within its statutory authority and followed all applicable procedural requirements as defined by Alabama law. The court's role is to review for legal error, not to re-decide the case. Question 2. Examination of the data shows that the Alabama Department of Environmental Management is considering a new regulation to address an emerging contaminant found in a specific groundwater source. While the contaminant is not yet present in widespread public water supplies, preliminary studies suggest it could pose a significant long-term health risk if left unaddressed. The agency believes that developing a comprehensive regulation through the standard notice and comment period will take too long to prevent potential future harm. Which of the following approaches best balances the agency's duty to protect public health with the requirements of Alabama's Administrative Procedure Act regarding rulemaking exemptions? Option A. Initiate the standard rulemaking process, but request expedited review and public comment periods from the Joint Committee on Administrative Regulation, while simultaneously conducting public outreach to inform stakeholders about the potential risks. Option B. Immediately promulgate a rule under the emergency rulemaking exception, citing the potential long-term health risks identified in preliminary studies as justification for bypassing the standard notice and comment period. Option C. Declare an immediate public health emergency and issue an emergency rule without any prior public notification or justification, based on the agency's internal assessment of potential future risks. Option D. Issue an advisory notice to water providers and the public about the potential risks, and then proceed with the standard rulemaking process without seeking any exemptions. The correct answer is B. Immediately promulgate a rule under the emergency rulemaking exception, citing the potential long-term health risks identified in preliminary studies as justification for bypassing the standard notice and comment period. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a government agency in Alabama to balance the need for efficient action with the fundamental principles of administrative law, specifically the public's right to participate in rulemaking. The agency must determine if an emergency situation truly exists that warrants bypassing standard notice and comment procedures, a decision that carries significant legal and public trust implications. Misjudging the urgency or the scope of the exemption can lead to legal challenges, loss of public confidence, and potentially ineffective or harmful regulations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough, documented assessment of the situation against the specific criteria for emergency rulemaking exemptions outlined in Alabama law. This approach prioritizes adherence to the spirit and letter of the law by requiring concrete evidence of an immediate threat to public health, safety, or welfare that cannot be addressed through the standard rulemaking process. The agency must be able to articulate precisely why the standard process is inadequate and why immediate action is imperative, thereby demonstrating good faith and a legitimate basis for the exemption. This aligns with the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act's intent to allow for necessary exceptions while safeguarding public participation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves invoking the emergency exemption based on a generalized concern about potential future problems without specific, immediate evidence of harm. This fails to meet the legal threshold for an emergency, as it bypasses the requirement for an imminent threat. It undermines public trust by suggesting the agency is using the exemption to avoid scrutiny rather than to address a genuine crisis. Another incorrect approach is to use the emergency exemption as a matter of convenience or to expedite a policy preference that does not involve an immediate threat. This is a direct violation of the statutory intent behind emergency rulemaking provisions, which are intended for truly exigent circumstances, not routine policy implementation. Such an action erodes the integrity of the rulemaking process and disrespects the public's right to participate. A further incorrect approach is to rely on informal discussions or internal agency consensus to justify an emergency exemption without conducting a formal, documented review of the facts and legal basis. This lacks transparency and accountability, making it difficult to defend the decision if challenged. It also fails to provide a clear record for judicial review, which is essential for ensuring that exemptions are applied appropriately. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama state agencies should approach potential emergency rulemaking exemptions by first exhaustively exploring whether the standard notice and comment procedures can be reasonably adapted to address the situation, even if with some expedited timeline. If the situation demonstrably poses an immediate and severe threat that cannot be mitigated through standard procedures, the agency must meticulously document the specific facts supporting the emergency, the nature of the threat, and why the standard process is insufficient. This documentation should be reviewed by legal counsel and clearly articulate the rationale for invoking the exemption, ensuring compliance with the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act and maintaining public accountability. Question 3. Upon reviewing a proposed administrative rule by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, concerning wastewater discharge limits, a major industrial facility in Mobile, Alabama, raises significant concerns about the feasibility and economic impact of the proposed limits. The facility argues that the technology required to meet these limits is prohibitively expensive and may not be readily available. As an ADEM policy advisor, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with Alabama administrative law principles? Option A. Proceed with the rule as initially proposed without further engagement or modification, relying solely on ADEM inherent authority to set environmental regulations. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the statutory authority underpinning the proposed rule, assess the scientific and economic data supporting the limits, and engage with the facility to understand the specific challenges and explore potential modifications that remain consistent with ADEM environmental protection mandate and legal authority. Option C. Immediately dismiss the facility's concerns as outside the scope of ADEM authority to regulate environmental standards, citing the agency's broad powers to protect public health and the environment. Option D. Agree to significantly relax the proposed discharge limits to accommodate the facility's economic concerns without a detailed analysis of the environmental impact or statutory justification for such a reduction. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of the statutory authority underpinning the proposed rule, assess the scientific and economic data supporting the limits, and engage with the facility to understand the specific challenges and explore potential modifications that remain consistent with ADEM environmental protection mandate and legal authority. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the public interest, as represented by the agency's mandate, with the specific concerns of a regulated entity. The Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, APA, governs the procedures by which administrative agencies in Alabama operate, including rulemaking and adjudication. A key aspect of this is ensuring transparency, fairness, and adherence to statutory authority. The best approach involves a thorough review of the proposed rule's statutory basis and its potential impact, followed by engagement with the regulated entity to understand their specific concerns and explore potential modifications that align with the agency's objectives and legal authority. This approach respects the agency's rulemaking authority while acknowledging the importance of considering stakeholder input and ensuring the rule is both effective and legally sound. The APA emphasizes procedural fairness and the need for rules to be within the scope of the agency's delegated powers. Engaging with the regulated entity in a structured manner, such as through formal comment periods or informal discussions after initial proposal, allows the agency to gather valuable information that can lead to a better crafted rule. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the regulated entity's concerns outright without substantive review, citing only the agency's broad authority. This fails to acknowledge the procedural due process considerations inherent in administrative law and the spirit of stakeholder engagement encouraged by the APA. It risks creating a rule that is overly burdensome, potentially outside the agency's statutory scope, or subject to legal challenge on procedural grounds. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately agree to significant concessions that fundamentally alter the rule's intended purpose without a clear justification rooted in statutory authority or a demonstrable improvement in achieving the agency's public interest goals. This could be seen as an abdication of the agency's responsibility to implement its mandate effectively and could lead to accusations of favoritism or arbitrary decision-making. A third incorrect approach would be to proceed with the rule as initially drafted without any further consideration of the regulated entity's feedback, simply because the agency has the authority to do so. This neglects the practical implications of the rule and the potential for unintended consequences, which could undermine the rule's effectiveness and lead to future disputes or the need for costly amendments. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the legal framework governing the agency's actions, including the specific statutes it administers and the APA. They should then objectively assess the proposed rule's alignment with legislative intent and public interest. Engaging with stakeholders, including regulated entities, is crucial for gathering diverse perspectives and identifying potential issues. Any proposed modifications should be evaluated against the agency's statutory authority and its ability to achieve its stated objectives. Transparency and a commitment to fair process are paramount throughout the decision-making process. Question 4. When evaluating the regulatory requirements for a new waste disposal service operating within Alabama, which approach best ensures compliance with state laws and avoids potential penalties? Option A. Directly consulting the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, to understand their specific permitting, operational, and reporting requirements for waste disposal. Option B. Focusing inquiries on the Alabama Department of Revenue to understand any applicable business taxes and fees. Option C. Primarily seeking guidance from the Alabama Public Service Commission, PSC, regarding transportation and service provision regulations. Option D. Relying on advice from the local county health department for public health and sanitation standards. The correct answer is A. Directly consulting the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, to understand their specific permitting, operational, and reporting requirements for waste disposal. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a business owner in Alabama who is seeking to understand the regulatory landscape for their new waste disposal service. The challenge lies in navigating the complex web of administrative agencies and their respective jurisdictions to ensure compliance. Misinterpreting agency authority can lead to significant penalties, operational delays, and reputational damage. Therefore, a careful and informed judgment is required to identify the correct agency responsible for oversight. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves proactively identifying the primary state agency responsible for environmental protection and waste management in Alabama. This agency is typically tasked with setting standards, issuing permits, and enforcing regulations related to the handling, storage, treatment, and disposal of various types of waste. By directly consulting the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, the business owner can obtain accurate information regarding licensing, operational requirements, and reporting obligations specific to their waste disposal activities. This direct engagement ensures compliance with Alabama law and avoids potential conflicts with other agencies that may have tangential but not primary oversight. Incorrect approaches analysis. Focusing solely on the Alabama Public Service Commission, PSC, is an incorrect approach because the PSC's primary jurisdiction is over public utilities, transportation, and telecommunications. While some waste disposal services might involve transportation, the core regulatory authority for environmental impact and waste management rests with the Environmental Agency, not the PSC. Relying on this agency would lead to a failure to obtain necessary environmental permits and adhere to waste disposal standards. Consulting the Alabama Department of Revenue for guidance is also an incorrect approach. Tax implications are important for any business. The Department of Revenue's role is primarily fiscal. They do not regulate the operational or environmental aspects of waste disposal services. This approach would neglect the critical environmental compliance requirements mandated by Alabama law. Seeking advice from the local county health department, while potentially useful for certain public health aspects, is an incomplete and potentially incorrect approach for comprehensive waste disposal regulation. County health departments often address localized public health concerns, but the overarching regulatory framework for waste management, including permitting and environmental standards, is typically established and enforced at the state level by the ADEM. This approach risks overlooking state-level requirements and may not provide the full scope of regulatory obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a systematic approach to identifying regulatory oversight. This involves 1. Clearly defining the nature of the business activity and its potential impacts, environmental, public health, economic. 2. Identifying the state-level agencies whose mandates align with these impacts. 3. Prioritizing the agency with the most direct and comprehensive regulatory authority over the core business function. 4. Consulting the identified primary agency's official resources, websites, regulations, contact personnel for specific guidance. 5. Cross-referencing with other potentially relevant agencies only after understanding the primary regulatory framework to address any overlapping or ancillary requirements. Question 5. The analysis reveals that a manufacturing facility in Mobile, Alabama, is planning to implement a new process that may result in air emissions. The company's environmental manager is unsure whether to primarily focus on compliance with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's EPA, National Ambient Air Quality Standards (NOx), or the specific air pollution control regulations established by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM. What is the most prudent course of action for the company to ensure full regulatory compliance in Alabama? Option A. Prioritize adherence to the federal EPA's NOx, as they are generally less stringent than many state-specific requirements, thereby minimizing immediate compliance burdens. Option B. Rely exclusively on the interpretation and guidance provided by the company's external environmental consulting firm regarding which regulations to follow. Option C. Conduct a detailed review of both federal EPA regulations and Alabama ADEM regulations pertaining to air emissions, and proactively contact both agencies to clarify their respective roles and specific requirements for the planned process. Option D. Assume that federal EPA regulations are the sole governing authority for air emissions, as they represent the national standard. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed review of both federal EPA regulations and Alabama ADEM regulations pertaining to air emissions, and proactively contact both agencies to clarify their respective roles and specific requirements for the planned process. Explanation. The analysis reveals a common professional challenge in navigating the overlapping yet distinct regulatory landscapes of federal and state agencies, particularly in Alabama. This scenario demands careful judgment because misinterpreting the scope of authority between the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, can lead to significant legal, financial, and operational consequences for a business. Understanding which agency has primary jurisdiction for a specific environmental matter is crucial for compliance and effective risk management. The best professional approach involves a thorough assessment of the specific environmental issue and its potential impact, followed by a direct consultation with both the federal and state agencies to clarify their respective roles and requirements. This proactive engagement ensures that all applicable regulations are identified and adhered to, preventing potential enforcement actions or conflicting directives. This approach is correct because it prioritizes direct communication with the relevant regulatory bodies, acknowledging that while federal laws set a baseline, state agencies like ADEM often have delegated authority and may impose stricter or more specific requirements within their jurisdiction. This aligns with the principle of seeking clarity from the source of authority. An incorrect approach would be to assume that federal EPA regulations automatically supersede all state-level environmental regulations in Alabama. This fails to recognize that states can and often do implement their own environmental protection programs, which must be at least as stringent as federal requirements, and can be more so. This can lead to noncompliance with ADEM-specific mandates, even if federal EPA standards are met. Another incorrect approach is to solely rely on the advice of a private consultant without independently verifying the jurisdictional scope with the agencies themselves. While consultants can provide valuable guidance, their interpretation may be incomplete or outdated, and they do not possess the ultimate authority to define agency jurisdiction. This approach risks misinterpreting regulatory responsibilities and potentially overlooking critical state-specific requirements. Finally, an incorrect approach is to prioritize compliance with the less stringent of the two sets of regulations, federal or state, without a clear understanding of which agency has primary enforcement authority for the specific issue. This can lead to violations of the more stringent regulations and subsequent penalties. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly defining the environmental issue and the activities involved. 2. Researching relevant federal statutes and regulations, e.g., Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and their implementing EPA rules. 3. Researching relevant Alabama statutes and ADEM regulations. 4. Identifying any delegation of authority from the EPA to ADEM for specific programs. 5. If ambiguity remains, initiating direct, documented communication with both the EPA and ADEM to seek clarification on jurisdictional responsibilities and applicable requirements. 6. Documenting all communications and decisions. Question 6. Comparative studies suggest that the scope of judicial review for administrative decisions varies significantly. An environmental consulting firm in Alabama is seeking judicial review of a permit denial by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM. The firm believes ADEM decision was incorrect and will cause significant financial harm. Which of the following approaches best represents the legally permissible and professionally advisable strategy for challenging ADEM decision in an Alabama court? Option A. Request that the court conduct a de novo review of the permit application, making its own independent determination of whether the permit should be granted, irrespective of ADEM findings. Option B. Assert that ADEM denial was arbitrary and capricious solely because the firm disagrees with the agency's interpretation of the technical data submitted. Option C. Argue that the court should review the administrative record and overturn ADEM decision because it was not the outcome the firm desired and has resulted in substantial economic hardship. Option D. Focus the legal argument on demonstrating that ADEM exceeded its statutory authority, misinterpreted applicable environmental laws, or based its denial on findings not supported by substantial evidence in the administrative record. Correct answer is C. Argue that the court should review the administrative record and overturn ADEM decision because it was not the outcome the firm desired and has resulted in substantial economic hardship. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an administrative law practitioner in Alabama to navigate the complex landscape of judicial review of agency decisions, specifically concerning the scope of review and the deference owed to the agency's findings. The practitioner must balance the client's desire for a favorable outcome with the legal limitations imposed by Alabama law on how a court can examine an administrative decision. Careful judgment is required to identify the most appropriate legal avenue for challenging the agency's action, avoiding frivolous arguments that could prejudice the client's case or incur unnecessary costs. The best professional approach involves seeking judicial review based on specific legal errors made by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, in its denial of the permit. This approach correctly recognizes that Alabama courts generally afford significant deference to the factual findings and discretionary decisions of administrative agencies, provided those decisions are supported by substantial evidence and are not arbitrary or capricious. Focus should be on demonstrating that ADEM exceeded its statutory authority, misinterpreted the law, failed to follow its own procedural rules, or made a decision unsupported by the evidence presented. This aligns with Alabama Code Section 41-22-20, which outlines the grounds for judicial review, including findings not supported by substantial evidence, arbitrary or capricious actions, or violations of statutory authority. An incorrect approach would be to argue that the court should simply substitute its own judgment for that of ADEM, essentially re-adjudicating the permit application as if it were a new case. This fails to acknowledge the deference Alabama courts are legally bound to give to agency expertise and findings of fact. Such an argument would likely be rejected by the court as exceeding the permissible scope of judicial review under Alabama law. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the economic hardship the client is experiencing due to the permit denial, without linking this hardship to a specific legal error by ADEM. While economic impact is a significant concern for the client, it is not in itself a ground for overturning an administrative decision unless it stems from an unlawful or arbitrary action by the agency. Alabama's Administrative Procedure Act does not permit judicial review based solely on the applicant's financial detriment if the agency's decision was otherwise legally sound. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to claim that ADEM decision was wrong simply because the client disagrees with it. This lacks any legal basis for challenging the agency's action. Judicial review is not an appeal of mere disagreement. It requires demonstrating a specific legal deficiency in the agency's process or decision-making, such as a lack of substantial evidence, an error of law, or a procedural irregularity. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should begin with a thorough review of the administrative record and the relevant Alabama statutes and regulations governing the agency's authority and the grounds for judicial review. The practitioner must then assess whether the client's case presents demonstrable legal errors by the agency, rather than simply a disagreement with the outcome. This involves identifying specific instances where the agency may have exceeded its powers, misinterpreted the law, failed to follow proper procedures, or based its decision on insufficient evidence. The strategy should then be tailored to these specific legal deficiencies, seeking to persuade the court that the agency's action warrants reversal or modification based on established legal principles of administrative law in Alabama. Question 7. The investigation demonstrates that an administrative law judge presiding over a contested case in Alabama had a significant prior professional association with the legal counsel representing one of the parties. What is the most appropriate course of action for the administrative law judge to ensure the integrity of the proceedings and uphold the principles of due process under Alabama law? Option A. Wait to disclose the prior professional association until a party raises an objection or inquiry. Option B. Immediately disclose the prior professional association to all parties and recuse themselves from further participation in the case. Option C. Proceed with the case, relying on their personal ability to remain impartial and make a fair decision. Option D. Inform the parties that the prior association was minor and unlikely to affect their judgment. Then continue presiding over the case. The correct answer is B. Immediately disclose the prior professional association to all parties and recuse themselves from further participation in the case. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a situation where an administrative law judge, ALJ, in Alabama faces a conflict of interest due to a prior professional relationship with a party involved in a case before them. This scenario is professionally challenging because ALJs are bound by strict ethical codes and the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, APA, to ensure fairness, impartiality, and due process. The appearance of bias, even if unintentional, can undermine public trust in the administrative process. Careful judgment is required to navigate such situations to uphold the integrity of the proceedings. The best approach involves the ALJ immediately disclosing the prior relationship to all parties involved and recusing themselves from the case. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the potential for bias and upholds the fundamental principles of impartiality and due process enshrined in Alabama law. The APA, while not explicitly detailing every conflict scenario, mandates that administrative proceedings be conducted fairly. Recusal, in this context, is the most robust mechanism to prevent any perception or reality of prejudice, ensuring that the decision-maker is free from any influence that could compromise their objectivity. This proactive disclosure and withdrawal safeguard the rights of all parties and maintain the legitimacy of the ALJ's office. An incorrect approach would be for the ALJ to proceed with the case, believing they can remain impartial despite the prior relationship. This fails to acknowledge the objective standard of fairness and the importance of the appearance of impartiality. Alabama's administrative law principles, like those in most jurisdictions, emphasize that justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done. Proceeding without disclosure or recusal risks violating due process rights and could lead to the decision being overturned on appeal. Another incorrect approach would be for the ALJ to only disclose the relationship if specifically asked by a party. This places the burden of identifying potential conflicts on the parties, which is contrary to the ALJ's affirmative duty to avoid conflicts and ensure a fair hearing. It also creates an adversarial situation where parties might feel compelled to question the ALJ's integrity, further eroding trust in the process. A final incorrect approach would be for the ALJ to attempt to downplay the significance of the prior relationship to the parties. This is ethically unsound as it misrepresents the potential impact of the conflict and fails to provide full transparency. The goal is not to persuade parties that the relationship is insignificant, but to ensure that the decision-maker is unequivocally unbiased. The professional reasoning process for such situations should involve a clear understanding of the ALJ's ethical obligations and the relevant provisions of the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act. When a potential conflict arises, the ALJ should first assess the nature and extent of the relationship and its potential to influence their judgment. If there is any doubt, the default action should be disclosure and consideration of recusal. This proactive and transparent approach is crucial for maintaining the integrity of the administrative justice system in Alabama. Question 8. Analysis of the Alabama Department of Environmental Management's (ADEM) statutory authority and operational practices, which include promulgating regulations for air and water quality, conducting investigations into potential violations, and holding administrative hearings to determine compliance and impose penalties, leads to a critical understanding of its classification within Alabama's administrative law framework. Which of the following best describes the classification of a DEM based on these characteristics? Option A. A DEM should be classified solely as a rulemaking body, as its primary and most significant contribution to environmental protection lies in the creation of regulations, with enforcement and adjudication being handled by separate judicial entities. Option B. A DEM is primarily an investigatory agency, with its rulemaking and adjudicatory powers being secondary and incidental to its core function of identifying and reporting environmental concerns to other governmental bodies. Option C. A DEM is best classified as a hybrid administrative agency possessing both quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial functions, along with independent investigatory and enforcement powers, as defined by its enabling statutes and the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act. Option D. A DEM is a purely advisory agency whose pronouncements and findings are non-binding and serve only to inform policy decisions made by the Alabama legislature. The correct answer is C. A DEM is best classified as a hybrid administrative agency possessing both quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial functions, along with independent investigatory and enforcement powers, as defined by its enabling statutes and the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an understanding of the fundamental distinctions between different types of administrative agencies in Alabama. Misidentifying an agency's classification can lead to incorrect assumptions about its powers, procedures, and the scope of judicial review available for its decisions. This can have significant consequences for regulated entities and the public, impacting due process and the effectiveness of administrative oversight. Careful judgment is required to accurately categorize the agency based on its statutory authority and operational characteristics. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a thorough examination of the agency's enabling statute and its primary functions. This means determining whether the agency is primarily engaged in rulemaking, quasi-legislative, adjudication, quasi-judicial, or a combination of both, and whether it possesses independent investigatory or enforcement powers. An agency that primarily promulgates rules of general applicability and enforceability and conducts hearings to determine violations of those rules is characteristic of a regulatory agency with both legislative and judicial functions. This aligns with the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act's framework for agency actions. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to classify an agency solely based on its name or the general industry it oversees, without scrutinizing its statutory mandate. For instance, labeling an agency as purely enforcement without considering its rulemaking authority would be a mischaracterization. Another incorrect approach is to assume all agencies operate with the same level of independence or possess the same procedural safeguards. For example, confusing an advisory committee with a formal adjudicatory body would lead to an erroneous understanding of its legal standing and the weight of its pronouncements. Finally, focusing only on an agency's historical role without considering its current statutory powers would also be a flawed method of classification. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach the classification of administrative agencies by first identifying the relevant Alabama statutes that create and empower the agency. They must then analyze the specific powers granted by these statutes, paying close attention to whether the agency is authorized to create binding rules, conduct formal hearings to resolve disputes, and issue orders with legal effect. Comparing these powers against established typologies of administrative agencies, e.g., rulemaking bodies, adjudicatory bodies, hybrid agencies, will lead to an accurate classification. This systematic, statute-driven analysis ensures compliance with Alabama law and provides a solid foundation for understanding the agency's legal authority and limitations. Question 9. Consider a scenario where the newly appointed director of the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, a DEM, believes that establishing a specialized climate resilience task force within the agency, independent of existing divisions and with broad authority to issue advisory guidelines on climate adaptation strategies, would significantly enhance a DEM effectiveness. The director's rationale is based on a perceived need to address emerging environmental challenges proactively, drawing inspiration from similar initiatives in other jurisdictions. Which of the following courses of action best reflects adherence to Alabama's administrative law principles regarding the creation and organization of administrative agencies. Option A. The director should proceed with establishing the task force, arguing that the agency's general mandate to protect Alabama's environment implicitly grants the authority to create such specialized units to address evolving threats. Option B. The director should immediately implement the task force, citing successful climate resilience initiatives in other states as precedent for the necessity and legality of such an organizational structure. Option C. The director must first consult the Alabama Code to identify the specific legislative act that created a DEM and review its provisions to determine if such a task force and its proposed authority are contemplated or permitted by the enabling legislation. Option D. The director should create the task force and grant it advisory guideline issuance powers, assuming that the agency's inherent executive authority allows for the creation of necessary internal structures to fulfill its mission. Correct answer is C. The director must first consult the Alabama Code to identify the specific legislative act that created a DEM and review its provisions to determine if such a task force and its proposed authority are contemplated or permitted by the enabling legislation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires understanding the foundational principles of administrative agency creation within Alabama law, specifically how legislative intent translates into agency structure and authority. Misinterpreting these principles can lead to actions that are ultra vires, undermining the agency's legitimacy and effectiveness. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act and the specific enabling legislation for any given agency. The best approach involves a thorough review of the Alabama Code and the specific legislative act that established the agency in question. This legislative act is the primary source of authority, defining the agency's purpose, powers, and organizational structure. Adhering strictly to the enumerated powers and organizational mandates within this enabling legislation ensures that the agency operates within its lawful bounds. This aligns with the principle that administrative agencies derive their authority solely from the legislature and must act in accordance with the legislative will. An incorrect approach would be to assume broad, inherent powers for the agency beyond those explicitly granted by its enabling legislation. This disregards the principle of legislative supremacy in administrative law, where agencies are creatures of statute and their powers are limited to those delegated. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on practices or organizational structures of similar agencies in other states or at the federal level without verifying their applicability and legality under Alabama law. This fails to recognize the unique statutory framework governing each Alabama agency. Finally, attempting to create new organizational units or delegate authority in a manner not contemplated by the enabling legislation, even if perceived as efficient, constitutes an overreach of authority and a violation of Alabama administrative law. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the specific Alabama statute that created the agency. They must then meticulously analyze the provisions of that statute to understand the agency's mandated purpose, its scope of authority, and its prescribed organizational framework. Any proposed action or organizational change should be directly traceable to and authorized by the enabling legislation. When in doubt, seeking formal legal counsel or an opinion from the Alabama Attorney General's office is a prudent step to ensure compliance. Question 10. During the evaluation of a potential violation of Alabama's environmental protection statutes by a small business, an investigator for the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, suspects that the business may have illegally discharged pollutants into a local waterway. The alleged violations, if proven, could result in fines. The investigator believes that reviewing the business's financial records for the past 5 years will help determine the extent of the business's profitability and its ability to pay potential fines, thereby informing the penalty assessment. The business has indicated that its total revenue for the past 5 years was $1,250,000. The maximum statutory fine per day for the alleged violation is $5,000. If the business is found to have committed the violation for 150 days, what is the maximum potential fine the business could face, and is the investigator's request for 5 years of financial records, given the total revenue, a proportionate and legally justifiable scope for an initial information gathering phase under Alabama law. Option A. The maximum potential fine is $625,000. The request for 5 years of financial records is proportionate and legally justifiable, as it helps assess the business's overall financial health. Option B. The maximum potential fine is $750,000. The request for 5 years of financial records is legally justifiable only if the investigator first obtains a subpoena ducis tecum, as a DEM does not have inherent authority to demand such records without one. Option C. The maximum potential fine is $750,000. The request for 5 years of financial records is proportionate and legally justifiable, as it provides context for the business's financial standing relative to the potential penalty, which is a standard component of penalty assessment under Alabama administrative law. Option D. The maximum potential fine is $750,000. The request for 5 years of financial records is overly broad and not legally justifiable, as the investigator should only request records directly related to the period of the alleged violation. The correct answer is C. The maximum potential fine is $750,000. The request for 5 years of financial records is proportionate and legally justifiable, as it provides context for the business's financial standing relative to the potential penalty, which is a standard component of penalty assessment under Alabama administrative law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between an agency's need to gather information for an investigation and an individual's right to privacy and due process. The investigator must navigate these competing interests while adhering strictly to the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act (APA) and relevant case law concerning investigative powers. Failure to do so can lead to the suppression of evidence, administrative sanctions against the investigator, and potential legal challenges to the agency's actions. The calculation requirement adds a layer of complexity demanding precise application of statutory limits. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a meticulous adherence to the statutory limits on investigative powers, including any financial thresholds for requiring specific types of documentation or actions. In Alabama, the APA grants broad investigative powers, but these are not unfettered. When an agency seeks to compel the production of financial records, it must often demonstrate a nexus between the requested information and the suspected violation. Furthermore, if the investigation involves potential penalties or fines, the agency must be mindful of due process requirements, which often include providing notice and an opportunity to be heard. The correct approach here is to calculate the potential financial exposure based on the alleged violations, and then determine if the scope of the requested information aligns with the statutory authority for investigations of that magnitude, ensuring that the demand for records is proportionate and legally justified. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and the protection of individual rights while still allowing for effective investigation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves demanding all financial records for the past 5 years without a clear, specific justification tied to the alleged violations, and without considering the potential financial implications of those violations. This overreaches the agency's authority and could be deemed an unreasonable or overly broad discovery request, violating principles of proportionality and due process. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with the demand for records without first calculating the potential financial exposure based on the alleged violations. This demonstrates a lack of diligence in understanding the legal framework governing the investigation and the potential consequences for the subject, increasing the risk of an unlawful or procedurally flawed investigation. A third incorrect approach is to assume that because an investigation is underway, the agency has unlimited access to all financial records, regardless of their relevance or the potential financial impact of the alleged violations. This ignores the statutory limitations and due process safeguards that are fundamental to administrative law in Alabama. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should adopt a systematic approach. First, thoroughly understand the specific allegations and the relevant statutes and regulations governing the agency's investigative powers in Alabama. Second, identify any statutory limits on the scope or duration of investigations, particularly concerning financial record requests. Third, if financial penalties are a potential outcome, calculate the maximum possible financial exposure based on the alleged violations and compare this to any statutory thresholds that might trigger different procedural requirements or limitations on investigative actions. Fourth, ensure that any information requested is directly relevant to the alleged violations and that the request is narrowly tailored to avoid being overly broad. Finally, consult with legal counsel if there is any ambiguity regarding the scope of investigative authority or procedural requirements. Question 11. Research into the Alabama Department of Environmental Management's recent guidance document concerning the interpretation of wastewater discharge permit renewal requirements reveals that the document outlines specific steps and criteria that must be met for a permit to be renewed. While the document is titled Guidance on Permit Renewal, it appears to establish mandatory conditions that were not previously explicit in the existing regulations or permit templates. Considering the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, what is the most appropriate professional approach to assessing the legal status of this guidance document? Option A. Assume the document is a policy statement because it is labeled guidance and therefore exempt from the formal rulemaking requirements of the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act. Option B. Treat the document as a policy statement if it offers clarification on existing regulations, even if it introduces new, specific requirements for permit renewal that were not previously articulated. Option C. Rely on the Alabama Department of Environmental Management's internal classification of the document as guidance without further independent analysis of its impact on regulated parties. Option D. Analyze the guidance document's content and effect to determine if it prescribes a procedure or practice, or affects substantive rights, thereby potentially constituting a rule under the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, regardless of its title. The correct answer is D. Analyze the guidance document's content and effect to determine if it prescribes a procedure or practice, or affects substantive rights, thereby potentially constituting a rule under the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, regardless of its title. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, APA, regarding the distinction between legally binding rules and non-binding policy statements. Mischaracterizing an interpretive rule as a policy statement, or vice versa, can have significant legal and operational consequences for the agency and regulated entities. The challenge lies in applying the statutory criteria to a specific agency pronouncement and determining its true legal effect, demanding careful analysis of the language, intent, and procedural history. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough review of the agency's pronouncement against the criteria established in the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act for distinguishing between rules and policy statements. This approach necessitates examining whether the pronouncement establishes a present right or obligation, prescribes a procedure or practice, or affects the substantive rights of the public. If the pronouncement meets these criteria, it is likely an administrative rule requiring formal promulgation under the APA. If it merely clarifies existing law or policy without creating new obligations, it may be a policy statement. This rigorous, fact-specific analysis ensures compliance with the APA procedural requirements for rulemaking, thereby upholding the principles of transparency, public participation, and due process inherent in administrative law. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that any document issued by an agency that is labeled a policy statement is automatically exempt from the rulemaking requirements of the APA. This fails to recognize that the APA looks to the substance and effect of the pronouncement, not merely its title. If a document, regardless of its label, prescribes a course of action that affects the rights or obligations of the public, it may still be considered a rule. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the agency's internal classification of the document without considering its impact on regulated parties. The APA definition of a rule is functional. It focuses on how the pronouncement operates in practice. An internal classification that ignores this functional impact can lead to non-compliance. A further incorrect approach is to treat all pronouncements that offer guidance or clarification as policy statements, even if they establish specific standards or requirements that are not explicitly found in existing statutes or regulations. This can result in the agency circumventing the formal rulemaking process, depriving the public of notice and an opportunity to comment on potentially binding requirements. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should adopt a systematic approach. First, identify the specific agency pronouncement in question. Second, consult the relevant provisions of the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, particularly those defining rule and outlining the rulemaking process. Third, analyze the content, language, and intended effect of the pronouncement. Does it create new obligations, rights, or procedures? Does it affect substantive rights? Fourth, consider the procedural history of the pronouncement. Was it subject to public notice and comment? Finally, based on this comprehensive analysis, determine whether the pronouncement constitutes a rule or a policy statement under the APA. If it appears to be a rule, advocate for its formal promulgation. If it is clearly a policy statement, ensure its limitations are understood and communicated. Question 12. System analysis indicates that an administrative law judge presiding over a contested case hearing in Alabama must render a decision. The judge has received all evidence and arguments from both the petitioner and the respondent. What is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with Alabama administrative law principles of adjudication? Option A. Consider information gathered during the agency's initial investigation that was not formally presented or admitted as evidence during the hearing. Option B. Issue a decision based solely on the evidence presented during the hearing and the applicable provisions of the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act and relevant agency regulations. Option C. Base the decision on a prior, similar case handled by the agency, even if the specific facts or legal arguments differ significantly. Option D. Consult with the agency's enforcement division after the hearing concludes to gain their perspective on the desired outcome before finalizing the decision. The correct answer is B. Issue a decision based solely on the evidence presented during the hearing and the applicable provisions of the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act and relevant agency regulations. Explanation. System analysis indicates that adjudicatory proceedings within Alabama administrative law present unique challenges due to the need to balance fairness to parties with the efficient administration of state programs. Professionals must navigate specific procedural rules and ethical considerations to ensure due process is upheld while respecting the agency's mandate. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the Administrative Procedure Act of Alabama, APA, and any agency-specific rules governing adjudication. This includes ensuring all parties have received proper notice of the proceedings, have had an opportunity to present evidence and arguments, and that the final decision is based solely on the evidence presented and relevant legal standards. Adherence to the principle of impartiality, avoiding ex parte communications, and ensuring the decision-maker is free from bias are paramount. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the due process requirements enshrined in the Alabama APA, which mandates fair hearings and decisions supported by substantial evidence. An incorrect approach would be to rely on informal understandings or prior agency practices that are not codified in regulations or statutes. This fails to provide parties with the predictable and transparent procedural safeguards guaranteed by law, potentially leading to challenges based on lack of due process. Another incorrect approach would be to allow the presiding officer to consider information outside the official record of the hearing, such as personal knowledge or external reports not formally introduced. This violates the fundamental principle that administrative decisions must be based on the evidence presented during the adjudication, as required by Alabama law, and undermines the fairness of the process. A further incorrect approach would be to unduly influence the decision-maker by the agency's enforcement or investigative staff after the close of evidence, without providing the respondent an opportunity to respond. This creates an appearance and reality of bias, compromising the impartiality required in administrative adjudication under Alabama law. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with identifying the specific legal framework governing the adjudication, including the Alabama APA and relevant agency rules. They must then meticulously assess the procedural steps taken against these requirements, ensuring all parties' rights are protected. When faced with ambiguity, consulting agency counsel or relevant legal precedent is crucial. The guiding principle should always be to uphold the integrity and fairness of the administrative process as defined by law. Question 13. The performance metrics show a recent increase in the number of administrative law judge recusal requests within the Alabama Department of Environmental Management. In one instance, an administrative law judge, ALJ, received a brief, unsolicited phone call from a representative of a regulated entity regarding a pending enforcement action. The representative stated they were calling to express their frustration with the perceived delay in the process. The ALJ listened briefly, stated they could not discuss the case, and ended the call. The ALJ did not inform the opposing party of this communication. What is the best course of action for the ALJ to ensure compliance with Alabama administrative law and maintain the integrity of the adjudication process? Option A. Rely on their personal assessment that the communication was harmless and proceed with the adjudication without informing the parties. Option B. Immediately recuse themselves from the case due to the ex parte communication, regardless of its content or potential impact. Option C. Immediately disclose the substance of the ex parte communication to all parties involved in the enforcement action and offer them an opportunity to respond or request further proceedings. Option D. Proceed with the adjudication without further action, considering the communication was brief and the ALJ did not discuss the merits of the case. Correct answer is C. Immediately disclose the substance of the ex parte communication to all parties involved in the enforcement action and offer them an opportunity to respond or request further proceedings. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for efficient administrative adjudication with the fundamental due process rights of the parties involved, specifically the right to a fair hearing and the appearance of impartiality. The Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, APA, governs these proceedings and mandates adherence to principles of fairness and due process. The best approach involves the presiding administrative law judge, ALJ, proactively addressing the ex parte communication by immediately disclosing the substance of the conversation to all parties and offering them an opportunity to respond or request further proceedings. This approach is correct because it aligns with the APA requirement for fairness and transparency in administrative adjudication. By disclosing the communication and providing an opportunity for rebuttal, the ALJ upholds the principle that all parties should have equal access to information and the chance to address any potentially prejudicial information. This proactive measure prevents the appearance of impropriety and ensures that the adjudication process remains impartial and unbiased, safeguarding the integrity of the administrative decision. An approach where the ALJ dismisses the communication as insignificant and proceeds without disclosure fails to acknowledge the potential for prejudice and violates the APA mandate for transparency and fairness. Ex parte communications, even if seemingly minor, can create an appearance of bias and undermine public trust in the administrative process. Another incorrect approach involves the ALJ immediately recusing themselves without any attempt to assess the impact of the communication or offer parties a chance to waive any concerns. While recusal is a tool to ensure impartiality, it should not be the automatic response to every ex parte communication, especially when the communication's content might not inherently compromise the ALJ's ability to render a fair decision. This approach can unnecessarily delay proceedings and may not be in the best interest of judicial economy or the parties. Finally, an approach where the ALJ relies solely on their personal judgment that the communication was harmless, without any disclosure or opportunity for party input, is ethically and regulatorily unsound. The APA requires that administrative proceedings be conducted in a manner that provides a fair hearing to all parties. Relying on personal assurances of harmlessness bypasses the procedural safeguards designed to protect this right and can lead to challenges based on due process violations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, fairness, and adherence to the specific procedural rules of the governing jurisdiction. When faced with potential ex parte communications, the framework should involve 1. Immediate recognition of the communication, 2. Assessment of its nature and potential impact, 3. Proactive disclosure to all parties, 4. Offering parties an opportunity to be heard or waive objections, and 5. Documenting all actions taken. This systematic approach ensures compliance with regulatory requirements and upholds the ethical standards of administrative adjudication. Question 14. The control framework reveals that the Alabama legislature is considering new methods to ensure administrative agencies are effectively implementing legislative intent, Which of the following legislative actions best upholds the principles of separation of powers and administrative oversight within Alabama? Option A. Approving the agency's annual budget without any review of its programmatic expenditures or policy initiatives. Option B. Directing a specific state agency to immediately cease all enforcement activities related to a particular environmental regulation without following statutory rule rescission procedures. Option C. Establishing a joint legislative committee to conduct periodic reviews of agency performance and to hold public hearings on proposed agency rules before they are finalized, as permitted by statute. Option D. Mandating that an agency hire specific individuals for key positions, overriding the agency head's hiring authority. The correct answer is C. Establishing a joint legislative committee to conduct periodic reviews of agency performance and to hold public hearings on proposed agency rules before they are finalized, as permitted by statute. Explanation: the control framework reveals a common tension in Alabama administrative law, the balance between legislative oversight and the operational independence of administrative agencies. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires understanding the constitutional boundaries of separation of powers as applied to the Alabama legislature's interaction with agencies created under its authority. Misinterpreting these boundaries can lead to legislative overreach or, conversely, an abdication of necessary oversight, both of which have legal and practical consequences. The best professional approach involves the Alabama legislature exercising its oversight powers through constitutionally permissible means, such as legislative review of agency rules and budgets, and the establishment of clear statutory mandates. This approach respects the agency's delegated authority to implement laws while ensuring accountability. Specifically, the legislature can conduct hearings, request reports, and where authorized by statute, approve or reject agency rules before they become effective. This aligns with the principle that while agencies execute laws, the legislature retains the power to shape those laws and oversee their implementation, as established by the Alabama Constitution and relevant statutes governing administrative procedure. An incorrect approach would be for the Alabama legislature to attempt to directly dictate specific operational decisions or policy choices of an agency that are not explicitly enumerated in the agency's statutory authority or subject to legislative rulemaking review. This could involve the legislature issuing directives that usurp the agency's discretion in areas where it has been granted expertise and authority by the General Assembly, thereby potentially violating the separation of powers by encroaching on executive functions. Another incorrect approach would be for the legislature to completely ignore its oversight responsibilities, allowing agencies to operate without any meaningful review of their actions or adherence to legislative intent. This failure to exercise legitimate oversight could lead to agencies acting in ways that are inconsistent with public policy or statutory goals, undermining the democratic accountability inherent in the legislative process. Finally, an incorrect approach would be for the legislature to attempt to bypass established administrative procedures for rulemaking or adjudication by issuing informal pronouncements or demands that circumvent the statutory framework governing agency actions. This would disregard the procedural safeguards designed to ensure fairness and predictability in administrative law. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the specific statutory authority granted to the agency and the corresponding oversight powers vested in the legislature. They must then analyze whether proposed legislative actions fall within these defined boundaries, prioritizing adherence to the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act and constitutional principles of separation of powers. Consulting relevant case law and legislative intent is crucial for navigating these complex interbranch relationships. Question 15. The performance metrics show a significant increase in permit processing times for the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM. Considering ADEM role as an independent regulatory agency, which of the following approaches best addresses this challenge while adhering to Alabama's administrative law principles? Option A. Immediately hire additional staff across all permit processing divisions to increase capacity and expedite reviews. Option B. Implement a policy to significantly shorten the review period for all permit applications, regardless of complexity, to meet historical processing time benchmarks. Option C. Conduct a thorough internal review of a DEM permit application workflow, resource allocation, and technological infrastructure, and engage with regulated industries to identify collaborative solutions for process improvement. Option D. Issue a public statement attributing the delays primarily to increased applicant complexity and a lack of responsiveness from regulated entities, without initiating an internal review. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough internal review of a DEM permit application workflow, resource allocation, and technological infrastructure, and engage with regulated industries to identify collaborative solutions for process improvement. Explanation: the performance metrics show a significant increase in permit processing times for the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts regulated entities' ability to operate and potentially affects public health and environmental protection, the core missions of ADEM. The agency must balance efficiency with thoroughness and adherence to its statutory mandates. Careful judgment is required to identify the root cause of the delays and implement effective solutions without compromising regulatory integrity. The best approach involves a comprehensive review of internal processes, resource allocation, and technological capabilities, coupled with proactive engagement with stakeholders. This method acknowledges that delays can stem from multiple factors, including staffing shortages, outdated technology, complex application reviews, or external factors affecting applicants. By systematically analyzing these areas and seeking collaborative solutions, DEM can identify systemic issues and implement targeted improvements. This aligns with the principles of good administrative governance, which emphasize efficiency, effectiveness, and responsiveness to the public and regulated entities, all within the framework of Alabama's environmental laws and regulations. An approach that solely focuses on increasing staff numbers without analyzing workflow or technological limitations is insufficient. While more staff might seem like a direct solution, it could lead to increased overhead without addressing underlying inefficiencies in how applications are processed or reviewed. This fails to provide a sustainable or cost-effective solution and may not resolve the core issues contributing to the delays. Another inadequate approach is to simply expedite reviews by reducing the depth of analysis or oversight. This directly contravenes ADEM's statutory duty to ensure compliance with environmental standards. Compromising the rigor of the review process to meet arbitrary speed targets risks environmental harm and legal challenges, undermining public trust in the agency's credibility. Finally, an approach that blames external factors or applicants without conducting an internal assessment is professionally irresponsible. While external factors can contribute, a responsible agency must first examine its own operations to identify areas for improvement. A failure to conduct this internal due diligence means potential internal inefficiencies are left unaddressed, perpetuating the problem. Professionals should approach such performance metric deviations by first establishing a clear understanding of the problem's scope and potential causes. This involves data analysis, process mapping, and stakeholder consultation. The next step is to develop a multifaceted strategy that addresses identified root causes, prioritizing solutions that are both effective and sustainable, and that uphold the agency's mission and legal obligations. Question 16. Which approach would be most appropriate for an Alabama state agency official when testifying before a legislative committee considering a bill that would significantly impact the agency's regulatory authority and operational budget? Option A. Decline to testify or provide any information, citing concerns about potential conflicts of interest and the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches. Option B. Engage in private, informal discussions with key committee members outside of formal hearings to influence their voting decisions on the bill. Option C. Provide factual information and expert analysis regarding the bill's potential effects on the agency's operations and the public, while refraining from advocating for specific legislative outcomes or engaging in adversarial questioning. Option D. Actively lobby committee members, presenting persuasive arguments and urging them to adopt specific amendments that align with the agency's preferred policy direction. The correct answer is C. Provide factual information and expert analysis regarding the bill's potential effects on the agency's operations and the public, while refraining from advocating for specific legislative outcomes or engaging in adversarial questioning. Explanation: This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an agency official to navigate the delicate balance between legislative, executive, and judicial functions within the administrative framework of Alabama. The official must act impartially while also advocating for the agency's position, creating a potential conflict of interest. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the agency's actions remain within its statutory authority and adhere to principles of due process and fairness. The best professional approach involves the agency official clearly delineating their roles and responsibilities. When participating in a legislative hearing, the official should focus on providing factual information and expert testimony regarding the agency's operational needs and the potential impact of proposed legislation. This approach upholds the agency's executive function by informing the legislative process with relevant data and insights. Simultaneously, by refraining from advocating for specific outcomes or engaging in adversarial questioning, the official respects the legislative body's independent decision-making authority and avoids overstepping into a judicial or quasi-judicial role. This maintains the integrity of the administrative process and ensures that the agency's actions are perceived as objective and fair. An approach where the agency official actively lobbies legislators for specific amendments or engages in persuasive arguments to steer the legislation in a particular direction is professionally unacceptable. This blurs the lines between the executive and legislative functions, potentially creating an appearance of undue influence and undermining the legislative body's independence. Furthermore, if the agency later has a role in enforcing the enacted legislation, such prior advocacy could compromise its ability to act impartially in any subsequent adjudicatory proceedings, thereby failing to uphold due process. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be for the agency official to refuse to provide any information or testimony to the legislative committee, citing a desire to avoid any perception of legislative involvement. While seemingly cautious, this stance fails to fulfill the agency's executive responsibility to inform and assist other branches of government. Alabama law generally expects agencies to be responsive to legislative inquiries and to provide necessary data for effective governance. This inaction could be interpreted as a dereliction of duty and hinder the legislative process. Finally, an approach where the agency official attempts to influence the legislative outcome by privately communicating with committee members outside of formal hearings, without disclosing these communications, is also professionally unsound. Such ex parte communications can create an appearance of impropriety and circumvent the transparency expected in the legislative process. It also risks compromising the agency's ability to act impartially if it later becomes involved in adjudicating matters related to the legislation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, impartiality, and adherence to statutory mandates. This involves understanding the distinct roles of legislative, executive, and judicial functions within Alabama's administrative law. When interacting with other branches of government, professionals must clearly define their purpose, disclose any potential conflicts, and act in a manner that upholds public trust and the integrity of the administrative process. Seeking guidance from agency, legal counsel is crucial when navigating complex situations that involve interbranch interactions. Question 17. Investigation of a reported illegal discharge into a creek on private industrial property in Mobile County, Alabama, has been initiated by an Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, investigator. The complainant, a downstream resident, provided photographic evidence from a public access point showing what appears to be a discolored discharge originating from the facility's property. The investigator needs to confirm the source and nature of the discharge, which requires access to the interior of the industrial facility. What is the most appropriate course of action for the ADEM investigator to take? Option A. Immediately enter the private property and conduct a thorough inspection of the facility to gather evidence of the alleged discharge. Option B. Postpone any further investigation until the property owner voluntarily contacts the agency to offer access. Option C. Rely solely on the photographic evidence provided by the complainant and issue a notice of violation without further investigation on site. Option D. Attempt to obtain voluntary consent from the property owner to enter the facility for inspection. If consent is refused, seek an administrative search warrant from a neutral magistrate. Correct answer is D. Attempt to obtain voluntary consent from the property owner to enter the facility for inspection. If consent is refused, seek an administrative search warrant from a neutral magistrate. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, a DEM investigator, is faced with a potential violation that could have significant environmental and public health consequences. The investigator must balance the need for thorough evidence gathering with the legal and ethical boundaries of their authority. The core of the challenge lies in obtaining information without overstepping the bounds of administrative law, particularly concerning search and seizure principles as applied to private property. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any enforcement action is based on legally obtained evidence and adheres to due process. The correct approach involves initiating a formal investigation based on the initial complaint, and then seeking consent or a warrant if access to private property is necessary. This method respects the property rights of the regulated entity while still allowing a DEM to fulfill its mandate. Specifically, the investigator should first attempt to gather information through publicly available records, interviews with the complainant, and visual observation from public areas. If access to the private property is deemed essential for a complete investigation, the investigator must then pursue either voluntary consent from the property owner or obtain an administrative search warrant from a neutral magistrate. This aligns with the principles of due process and the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, as interpreted within the context of Alabama administrative law. DEM enforcement powers, while broad, are not unlimited and are subject to constitutional and statutory constraints. An incorrect approach would be to enter the private property without consent or a warrant, even if the investigator suspects a violation. This action would constitute an unlawful search and seizure, violating the property owner's rights under the Alabama Constitution and potentially federal law. Evidence obtained through such an illegal search would likely be inadmissible in any subsequent enforcement proceeding, undermining the entire investigation and potentially leading to legal challenges against a DEM. Another incorrect approach would be to delay the investigation indefinitely due to a reluctance to seek a warrant or consent, even when such steps are clearly necessary and legally permissible. This inaction could allow environmental damage to continue or worsen, failing to protect public health and safety, and thus abdicating a DEM core responsibilities. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on hearsay or unsubstantiated rumors, without attempting to corroborate them through legally permissible means. While initial complaints are important, administrative enforcement actions must be based on credible evidence gathered through proper investigative procedures. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of a DEM's statutory authority and limitations, including the specific regulations governing inspections and evidence collection. Investigators should always prioritize legal and ethical conduct, seeking guidance from legal counsel when uncertain about the scope of their powers. A systematic approach, starting with less intrusive methods and escalating to more formal procedures like consent or warrants only when necessary, ensures that investigations are both effective and legally sound. Question 18. In an administrative hearing before an Alabama Department of Environmental Management hearing officer concerning a permit denial, a small business owner, appearing without legal counsel, seems confused about how to present evidence to challenge the agency's decision. The hearing officer suspects the owner does not fully grasp the concept of the burden of proof. What is the most appropriate course of action for the hearing officer to ensure a fair and procedurally sound hearing under Alabama law? Option A. The hearing officer should explain to the business owner that the party seeking to overturn an agency decision typically bears the burden of proving their case and outline what that generally entails, without suggesting specific evidence or arguments. Option B. The hearing officer should advise the business owner on the specific documents and testimony that would best support their challenge to the permit denial, effectively guiding their presentation of evidence. Option C. The hearing officer should immediately close the hearing and issue a ruling against the business owner, citing their failure to meet the burden of proof without any further inquiry. Option D. The hearing officer should proceed with the hearing as scheduled, allowing the business owner to present whatever they believe is relevant and make a decision based on the evidence presented, regardless of the owner's understanding of procedural burdens. The correct answer is A. The hearing officer should explain to the business owner that the party seeking to overturn an agency decision typically bears the burden of proving their case and outline what that generally entails, without suggesting specific evidence or arguments. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents an ethical dilemma for an administrative law judge in Alabama. The challenge lies in balancing the statutory requirement to maintain a fair and impartial hearing, with the potential for a party to be disadvantaged due to a misunderstanding of procedural rules, specifically the burden of proof. The judge must ensure that the hearing adheres to Alabama Administrative Procedure Act (APA) standards, while also upholding principles of due process and fairness, even when one party appears to be struggling with the procedural aspects. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the administrative law judge actively clarifying the burden of proof to the unrepresented party. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the procedural deficiency that is hindering the party's ability to present their case effectively. Under the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, administrative hearings are intended to be fair and provide an opportunity for all parties to present evidence and arguments. While the judge cannot act as an advocate, they have a duty to ensure the proceedings are conducted in a manner that allows for a just outcome. Explaining the burden of proof that the party seeking the benefit or challenging the agency action generally bears the responsibility to present evidence empowers the unrepresented party to understand what is required of them. This aligns with the spirit of due process and the APA mandate for fair hearings, preventing a decision based on procedural technicalities rather than substantive merits. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the hearing without any clarification, assuming the unrepresented party should have known the rules. This fails to uphold the principle of fairness and due process, as it allows a procedural misunderstanding to potentially dictate the outcome of the case, rather than the evidence. It also neglects the judge's role in ensuring a procedurally sound hearing, even for unrepresented individuals. Another incorrect approach is to actively guide the unrepresented party on what evidence to present or how to argue their case. This crosses the line from facilitating a fair hearing to becoming an advocate, which is a violation of judicial impartiality and ethical standards for administrative judges. A third incorrect approach is to immediately dismiss the case due to the unrepresented party's inability to meet the burden of proof without any attempt at clarification. This is overly punitive and fails to provide the party with a reasonable opportunity to understand and meet their obligations, thereby undermining the fairness of the administrative process. Professional reasoning. Professionals in administrative law should approach situations involving unrepresented parties with a commitment to procedural fairness. The decision-making process should begin with an assessment of whether the party understands the fundamental procedural requirements of the hearing. If a deficiency is identified, such as a misunderstanding of the burden of proof, the professional should consider interventions that clarify procedural rules without advocating for a particular outcome. This involves a careful calibration between maintaining impartiality and ensuring that all parties have a meaningful opportunity to be heard. The Alabama Administrative Procedure Act provides the framework for this balance, emphasizing fairness and due process. Question 19. The control framework reveals that a small business owner in Alabama has received a notice of a potential administrative hearing concerning an alleged zoning violation. The owner is unfamiliar with administrative procedures and seeks guidance on how to best navigate this situation to protect their rights and minimize potential penalties. Which of the following approaches best safeguards the owner's due process rights within the Alabama Administrative Law Framework? Option A. Ignore the notice, assuming the issue will be resolved without further action, and wait for the agency to initiate further proceedings. Option B. Proactively engage with the administrative agency to understand the allegations and evidence, explore informal resolutions, and prepare a substantive defense for the hearing. While advising the owner on their right to legal counsel, Option C. Focus exclusively on filing a motion to dismiss the hearing based on a potential lack of jurisdiction, without preparing to address the underlying zoning violation. Option D. Attend the hearing without prior preparation, relying on the owner's ability to explain their situation spontaneously to the administrative law judge. The correct answer is B. Proactively engage with the administrative agency to understand the allegations and evidence, explore informal resolutions, and prepare a substantive defense for the hearing, while advising the owner on their right to legal counsel. Explanation. The control framework reveals a scenario where a small business owner in Alabama is facing a potential administrative hearing regarding a zoning violation. This situation is professionally challenging because the owner, unfamiliar with administrative law, is at risk of significant penalties and operational disruption. The core challenge lies in ensuring the owner's due process rights are protected throughout the hearing process, balancing the need for efficient administrative resolution with fundamental fairness. Careful judgment is required to navigate the specific procedural rules of Alabama's administrative law and to advocate effectively for the owner's interests. The best professional approach involves proactively engaging with the administrative agency to understand the specific allegations and the procedural roadmap for the hearing. This includes requesting all relevant documentation, clarifying the agency's evidence, and exploring potential informal resolutions or settlement opportunities before the formal hearing. Crucially, it means advising the owner on their right to legal representation and preparing a robust defense strategy that addresses the alleged zoning violation directly, potentially including presenting evidence of compliance or mitigating circumstances. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principles of due process guaranteed under Alabama law, which include the right to notice, the opportunity to be heard, and the right to present evidence and confront opposing evidence. By actively seeking information and preparing a defense, the owner's rights are being vigorously protected within the established administrative framework. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the notice of the hearing, assuming the issue will resolve itself. This fails to acknowledge the legal gravity of the notice and the potential for default judgment or adverse findings. Ethically and regulatorily, this demonstrates a disregard for the administrative process and a failure to protect the client's interests, violating the duty of diligence and competence. Another incorrect approach would be to attend the hearing without understanding the specific allegations or the agency's evidence, and without preparing any defense. This approach, while appearing to engage with the process, is fundamentally flawed as it does not equip the owner to effectively exercise their right to be heard or to present a meaningful defense. It risks a superficial engagement with due process, where the opportunity to be heard is present in form but not in substance, potentially leading to an unfavorable outcome due to lack of preparation. A further incorrect approach would be to focus solely on challenging the jurisdiction of the administrative agency without addressing the substantive zoning violation. While jurisdictional challenges are a valid part of legal proceedings, neglecting to prepare for the underlying issue means that even if the jurisdictional challenge fails, the owner will be unprepared to defend against the actual violation, potentially leading to a negative outcome on the merits. This demonstrates a failure to provide comprehensive representation and to address all aspects of the client's legal predicament. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the client's situation, identifying the relevant legal and regulatory framework, in this case, Alabama administrative law and due process requirements, and developing a strategy that proactively addresses the client's rights and potential liabilities. This involves thorough investigation, clear communication with the client and the administrative agency, and diligent preparation for all stages of the administrative process, ensuring that the client's due process rights are fully realized. Question 20. Risk assessment procedures indicate that the Alabama Department of Environmental Protection, ADEP, is preparing to issue a new regulation concerning wastewater discharge permits. The public notice for the proposed regulation must be published at least 15 days prior to the public hearing. If the ADEP Bureau of Public Affairs mails the official notice to all registered stakeholders on October 1st, what is the earliest date the public hearing can be legally held in Alabama to comply with the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act? Option A, October 18th. Option B, October 15th. Option C, October 16th. Option D, October 17th. Correct answer is D, October 17th. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for efficient agency operations with the fundamental right of regulated entities to fair notice and an opportunity to be heard. Misinterpreting or misapplying the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, APA, regarding notice periods can lead to procedural defects, rendering agency actions invalid and potentially exposing the agency to litigation. The calculation of notice periods involves precise adherence to statutory timelines, making mathematical accuracy crucial. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves calculating the notice period by excluding the day of mailing and including the day of the hearing, as stipulated by Alabama law for agency rulemaking notice. Specifically, Alabama Code Section 41-22-4A. 1. Requires notice to be published at least 15 days prior to the hearing. Therefore, if the notice is mailed on October 1st, the 15-day period begins on October 2nd. Counting 15 days from October 2nd, inclusive, brings us to October 16th. Thus, a hearing scheduled for October 17th satisfies the statutory requirement. This approach ensures compliance with the APA procedural safeguards, guaranteeing that regulated parties receive adequate time to prepare their responses. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to count the mailing date as the first day of the notice period and exclude the hearing date. This would mean that if notice is mailed on October 1st, the 15-day period would end on October 15th, making a hearing on October 17th appear to be only 13 days of notice. This fails to comply with the statutory requirement of at least 15 days notice and violates the spirit of providing ample time for public comment. Another incorrect approach is to simply add 15 days to the mailing date without considering the exclusion of the mailing day and inclusion of the hearing day. If notice is mailed on October 1st, adding 15 days would result in October 16th. Scheduling the hearing for October 16th would mean only 14 full days of notice, which is insufficient. This method ignores the specific statutory language regarding how notice periods are calculated in Alabama. A third incorrect approach is to assume that at least 15 days means a full 16 days of notice must elapse. If notice is mailed on October 1st, this approach would require the hearing to be no earlier than October 18th. While this provides more notice than required, it is not the most efficient use of agency resources and does not precisely adhere to the minimum statutory requirement, potentially leading to unnecessary delays in rulemaking. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama administrative agencies must adopt a systematic approach to calculating notice periods. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant statutory provision, e.g., Alabama Code Section 41-22-4A. 1. 2. Understanding the specific rules for calculating time periods, exclusion of the first day, inclusion of the last. 3. Performing the calculation precisely, often using a calendar or date calculator. And 4. Cross-referencing the calculated date with the proposed hearing date to ensure compliance. When in doubt, consulting agency legal counsel or the relevant statutory text is paramount to avoid procedural errors.